You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. The misleaders of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation are not merely hypocrites of the lowest order, they are also crypto-leftists. The chief reason why this is so, not recognized by many, is that there is no actual right wing in that cult, although there is certainly the pretension of it. The pulse of that organized religion is not merely liberal, it is leftist, and often far left. However charismatic its leaders may or may not be, they exalt style, image, extravagance, and profile over facts, truth, and substance. They want you to exchange a great devotee for their ghosts and trade in your birthright for a role in their prison house. The collapse of adherence to spiritual orders and processes is at the root of their pseudo-devotional leftism. None of the misleaders of so-called ISKCON has any allegiance to fixed obligations or fixed devotional processes, and history has shown that they also have no obligation to do what Srila Prabhupada ordered them to do. This is the essence of their particular brand of leftism. They believe that they can create new obligations, new processes, and new truths. The Krishna conscious ideas have been changed, but they find that of no concern. They are confident that they will continue to attract similarly attached people to this attitude of obligation by choice, without Vedic and Parampara injunctions, strictures, or even without Vedic absolutes. After all, most of the ISKCON leaders are former hippies, and such defiance of cultural norms was strongly inculcated into their causal and astral bodies at that time. If it was checked by Prabhupada, that is proven now to be nothing more than a speed bump. No thoughtful criticism of their concepts and policies circulates within their misguided gerontocracy. All resistance to their covert leftism must come from outside of their circle, and they always hold the outside in utter contempt. The ideals of so-called ISKCON is whatever the power node governing body says that they are. Any legacy indicative of absolute truths coming from the tradition of Guru Parampara or from the founder Acharya himself, who was once their founder of their institution, is the legacy of yesteryear. The ISKCON conception is that the absolute truth is determined by the group and not by obligations to past acharyas. It is, in essence, not at all different from the Western mundane mood and style of leftism. The ever-shifting normal of so-called ISKCON is determined by the need of the moment, subject to change by the governing body. There is never any honest discussion of the root issues within their circle because such an analysis could result in a death blow to their whole concoction. The potential compensation for their outrageous deviations is a future where the absurdity reaches such proportions that it will become unmistakable to almost everyone. That day may very well come, but it is not here yet. Your host speaker is trying to speed it up. As Solzhenitsyn so aptly put it, quote, "The line separating good and evil neither passes through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart," unquote. The difference between a just and genuine civilization in the future, or its collapse into totalitarian savagery, is cent% dependent upon the eventual ascendancy of real Krishna consciousness, or the triumph of its current perverted reflection. We cannot set aside reason, logic, and Shastra, or the orders given by Prabhupada, in order to excuse the ISKCON religion. Their deviations are readily apparent and have been for decades. But you can only see them if you actually want to see them. ISKCON, metaphysics, and theology are a danger to humankind, both physiologically and psychologically. Sorting through their ecclesiological rationalizations with knowledge assists in those theories immediately falling apart right before your very eyes. But first, you have to realize who they are. Covert leftists in disguise. You cannot restore Prabhupada's movement within yourself or at any level while valuing such sahajas. It is a misconception that those pretenders, the political equivalents of leftists in a quasi-spiritual marketplace, are all enamored by loose behavior. Instead, many of them are quite self-controlled. Indeed, of the 13 kinds of suhujyas described by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, 2 are in this controlled category, namely the Smartas and the Jata Gosanis. These sahajas are different from the ISKCON sahajas, but the ISKCON sahajas, the leaders that is, have struck pay dirt with their well-honed Niyamagraha style and intimidation tactics. Most everybody in that cult, except the Chelas, Space Cadets, and Kickmes, are in on it, and they like it. It obviously meshes well with postmodern Hinduism also. You will be thwarted and frustrated at every step if your intention to restore the Krishna movement is not backed by real knowledge and the means to attain it. It all starts within yourself, and you must want to know the truth, no matter how heavy or so-called extreme it is. That is why a return to square one, both individually and collectively, is imperative. Conservative values in Krishna consciousness are required, because even the initial stages of Udhikari, which is an advanced stage of Krishna consciousness, is comprised of rules and regulations. It is also known as Vidhi Bhakti. These values, these conservative values, fly in the face of not only the ISKCON sahajas, but also in the grill of the cult's governing body, which is chock full of leftists. Regular guru means real guru. Institutional guru means bogus guru. Real guru entails the cultivation of perfect personal habits that promote liberation, mukti. These do not depend upon style or image or chutzpah. Instead, they include temperance, honesty, courage, and reverence for theism and theistic qualities. These are the qualities that made ISKCON great back in the day. The Krishna consciousness movement cannot be restored where these qualities no longer exist except as imitation. To restore the Krishna consciousness movement on any basis or at any level requires specific action, action free from compromise. To overturn the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, uncompromising decisions must be made. Devotees wanting to see things as they are and then act accordingly must be on a higher level than those pretenders. In order to rejuvenate Krishna consciousness within yourself and then perhaps on a wider basis, the first requirement is knowing the meaning of Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement, along with why it has now become almost destroyed. Such rejuvenation cannot possibly transpire without a return to the root issues, and they are not very mysterious. It requires the right attitude. If you have been traumatized by the whole thing, then it's time to confront that condition within yourself. Do not allow yourself to crumble, because that's exactly what those men want you to do. They want you to waver, to allow the cracks in your mind to deepen, and then to become apathetic. They want to make you ever intimidated, and if you remain passive, that is not difficult for them to accomplish. Now, the truth is very heavy, but there's no way around that. It appears to be extreme, but how could it be otherwise? Was it not extreme that 11 Ritviks all of a sudden, within 8 months, morphed into Uttama Udhikaris? It requires courage to stand against the endlessly mutable deviation of the fabricated so-called ISKCON. It requires complete honesty within oneself in order to realize that the current make-show is completely based upon deception. Action must trump inaction, and we have been at that crossroads for some time now.
I have a question.
Dr. Ernest.
You mentioned anti-intellectualism in the opening. Was there an attitude of anti-intellectualism in ISKCON even back in the 60s or into the 70s?
In the beginning of the movement, anti-intellectualism was not prominent. As a matter of fact, the early editions of Back to Godhead had some outstanding intellectual articles in them full of excellent comparative philosophy. These very interesting articles were written by either Raya Rama or Hayagriva. As the years rolled by, the BTG became less philosophical in content and more an instrument of the institution. Of course, it still contained at least a major article from one of Prabhupada's platform lectures, which by their nature were very philosophical and intellectual in terms of higher intelligence. When I entered the movement in mid-February 1972, anti-intellectualism was only in a budding stage, and lectures given by temple leaders were often still full of great theistic philosophy. These included some stark realizations. I remember one such lecture by the GBC of the Midwestern Zone in Detroit. He pointed out that it was no accident that the so-called priests wore garbs that were almost entirely black. An itinerant sannyasi also gave some provocative intellectual lectures in the early 70s. I look forward to him coming through Chicago in anticipation of his presentations. Then again, there was the other side of the coin, and I had quite a bit of experience of it even as early as 1972. When I was sent out from Detroit to reopen the Chicago temple, it was with a new ISKCON leader who did not deliver an interesting class. In fact, he constantly harped on one simple point, which was rather self-serving, to say the least. All right, hearing that once or twice would be acceptable, but hearing it every single morning during the Bhagavatam class, dominating the lecture, along with go out there and take the Lakshmi away from the demons, got real old real fast. It was certainly symptomatic of the anti-intellectualism that was gaining steam at that time. Another version of hardcore anti-intellectualism was transmitted by Kirtanananda Swami. Supposedly, this fellow was quite the philosopher during his heyday in New York City as an LSD guru. Ironically, he was ruthless when he mounted the pillow to spout his screed in ISKCON. One such troglodyte lecture at the Evanston Temple contained but one point: we know nothing. By that time, I had been engaged for years in heavy-duty tapasya. Day and night, I studied the books regularly whenever I got the chance, and I was putting the pieces of the puzzle together quite nicely, which paid dividends out in the field at the college campuses, where my party converted 5 students into initiated members of the Evanston Temple. They also came to live and serve there. But this sannyasi, allegedly an advanced man in Krishna consciousness and dear to the founder Acharya, is berating everybody in the temple room that they can only know one thing, that they know nothing. Such anti-intellectualism was a major contradiction to what Prabhupada stood for as related in his books, the most intellectual books ever published in the English language. Back in the day, did the devotees talk about philosophy when they associated? Never. Did they try to explain the bhakti science in terms of how Prabhupada had laid it out, including where he made it a bit difficult to understand? Well, I spoke like that to some degree in my classes, and in no small part, that got me branded as a black sheep. Of course, I produced tangible results in my seva, and that kept me valuable to most of the leaders I served under, until it didn't.
Vasugopal also has a question.
Vasugopal. Vasugopal, your question.
Just a moment ago, you mentioned Niyamagraha. It is common knowledge that Niyamagraha generally is translated to mean not following the rules and regulations. However, it seems you are not using it in that context. If you are not doing so, kindly explain what you mean by it.
Niyamagraha has 2 definitions or applications. The Sanskrit explanation of how this is so can be a bit tedious, so I shall not get into that here. Its 2 meanings or applications, ironically, are opposed to one another. Your question mentioned what may be considered the primary translation, but the other one is what I am referring to here. That one means that the so-called devotee strictly follows the rules and regulations for the purpose of gaining power from them, instead of trying to advance in bhakti. This is what the Sahaja groups do. Those 2 as aforementioned, listed by Bhaktivinoda Thakur. It is also what the leaders of the fabricated so-called ISKCON have almost perfected. Combined with their institutional statuses, they utilize strict adherence to ritual and regulated action in order to increase their power to intimidate. Sometimes this make-show can be discovered rather easily because it is just too superficial to be considered even quasi-legitimate. I remember a personal servant of a GBC for Western Europe telling me at the Stockholm Temple in 1976 how he closely observed his leader for a full 24 hours and concluded without doubt that the man could not have chanted more than 2 rounds during that time. That commissioner, when confronted by his personal servant about this, confirmed the fact. In other words, this flip side of Niyamagraha may not be all that it's cracked up to be. Aside from that, it still does involve some hardship, but the ISKCON leaders are all big-time enjoyers. Another way of saying the same thing is that it runs against the grain of where they are really at. As such, Niyamagraha, the following of rules and regulations for the purpose of power rather than for spiritual purification, is gradually running out of steam. Instead, it is being replaced by straightforward institutional intimidation delivered by institutional gurus, none of whom are bona fide spiritual masters.
Gokulananda also has a question.
Gokulananda.
Earlier in the presentation, you pointed out that most of the ISKCON leaders were former hippies, and that the defiance by hippies, the rejection of established norms, has carried over to what they're doing now. But didn't Prabhupada say that the hippies were his best customers? Wasn't there defiance of Western social, governmental, cultural, and religious norms helpful to their coming to Prabhupada and the Krishna counterculture?
The apparent contradiction that you are pointing out is just that. It's apparent. A good thing carried too far becomes its own opposite, and this is a universal principle. The hippies were Prabhupada's best customers, and that was so for many reasons. First of all, they were, on the whole, very detached from just about everything, and that detachment was a quality conducive for coming to Krishna consciousness. Also, and many people don't recognize this, they were very pessimistic about life. They were all, with few if any exceptions, humanists, but that freedom from religious dogma did not make them optimists. Quite the contrary. Their message music, if you analyze it, was almost entirely pessimistic, both lyrically and in its mood. Pessimistic humanism, granted, but pessimistic nevertheless. To be pessimistic about material life is not at all helpful for advancing in any material culture, and that's why many hippies lived on Desolation Row. At the same time, to be pessimistic about material life is helpful for coming to Krishna consciousness and finding real hope. Another reason that the hippies dominated the first wave of Prabhupada's disciples was the fact that they were suffering quite severely, particularly those who were trying to figure out the meaning of life. Was evil supreme? It sure seemed like it was to many hippies. Some of the latter iterations of their music went in this direction. Such a viewpoint is conducive to despair, which itself is non-different from extreme suffering. Yet despair is often helpful, at least in the beginning, for approaching Krishna consciousness. Many of the hippies knew the dark night of the soul, and they knew it from direct experience. And those who did not commit suicide as a result usually approached transcendence in some form. Another reason not to be overly glorified here is that to be a hippie meant to engage in experimentation with hallucinogens. Some drug-induced psychotropic trips gave a fleeting experience of different realities on different planes. Despite the hippie religion's inclination to voidism and the impersonal, occultism often resulted from those experiences. Sometimes this helped to lead towards Prabhupada's message, which was essentially mystical. Finally, to return to the chief point, defiance of religious dogma is a good thing. Defiance of man-made laws that abrogate basic human rights, particularly spiritual rights, is a good thing. Defiance of the cultural stranglehold of the West was also helpful back in the day. Defiance of so many all-pervading misconceptions, both philosophical and otherwise, tended to lead toward realization that everything here is Maya. Such a realization is also, on the whole, helpful to spiritual and devotional life, especially in its initial stages. Tattvamasi. But such defiance mostly becomes counterproductive once the genuine guru is contacted, recognized, and served. Defiance rooted in skepticism and cynicism is not at all conducive to realization when a disciple works under the guidance of a realized guru. When that dormant defiance from their hippie days reemerged into Prabhupada's movement after he left the scene, it did not produce results that helped to keep his line intact. It produced instead crypto-leftism. To some degree, as has just been discussed here, that 60s defiance was a good thing back then, because it helped to break the mold of cultural prejudice which restricted intelligence. Taken too far, however, and not employed in the right context at the right time, it becomes fundamentally changed by the downward pull of the universe. Based upon deductions rooted in Prabhupada's teachings, this presentation, the one that you are now viewing and hearing, works for concentration of mind and against that downward pull of the Jagat. The big lies of so-called ISKCON are meant to be broken down. Once you break away from their intoxicating influence, the dismantling of the dogma underpinning their Maya will inexorably proceed via the domino effect. The psychic shackles will fall off, and you will experience a natural freedom of mind and intelligence conducive to the development of genuine Krishna consciousness, and you will also be swimming against that strong downward current of samsara. The fabricated so-called ISKCON, even when it appears to be guided by Paka commissioners, Paka gurus, Paka presidents, and Paka sannyasis, actually represents the culmination of a leftist dream. Climbing the latticework of the ISKCON bureaucracy is the order of the day, and this mentality has infested that cult. As it turns out, such is also the way of the mundane world at this time. So-called ISKCON works in tandem with fate and with the Jagat, and it draws you into its gold-plated abyss through various means, both corporate and occult. You have to take the long view in order to know what so-called ISKCON is, and most importantly, what it could come to mean within the next 50 years. That's why we must expose, check, and uproot it at this time while we still can. The hour is late. We live in interesting times, mostly because we have this opportunity. Your seva is laid out right in front of you. You can contribute to the real Krishna movement, and that will be very important service indeed. This is no time to coast or to become a soft shoe shuffler. Once you see how ominous so-called ISKCON really is, even at this late hour if you see it, that realization is helpful. It's a bit heavy in the beginning, but transcendence is always like that. You start with fire, but you will lose the flame if you try to fight the thing within the walls of so-called ISKCON. It must be confronted from outside of its confines. In the service of the universal regulatrix, so-called ISKCON wants to conquer everything and everyone. But if you were to bring this fact up to any of its acolytes, what to speak of to its leaders, you would experience a heavy dose of feigned outrage. Nevertheless, within themselves, they are all hardcore triumphalists, believing that they have finally captured the formula, after having endured many embarrassing growing pains, the formula of the inevitability embedded within their matrix. You try to work with them and placate them, and after a short period of delusion, you will be paid back in spades for your gesture of peace and compromise. Either that, or you will become one of them. They are not meant to prevail in the end, not according to providence. Genuine Krishna consciousness is meant to be spread in a very different way from their way, which has no genuine connection to Krishna consciousness and never can have any such connection. The beginning of the battle is within your own self, especially if you have unfortunately imbibed the ISKCON beach. Once you win that internal battle, then it's time to engage. There are a number of factions to contend with, granted, and you must understand all of them for what they are and what their interrelationship is. Their acrimony, although real, is ultimately superficial. That factional fighting cannot be allowed to disguise the real enemy. Another way of saying the same thing is that so-called ISKCON is the big kahuna when it comes to an organized religion pushing Sahajya consciousness. It must be viewed and treated as the chief enemy because it represents the potential for tyranny, the likes of which has not been seen on this degraded middle planet for thousands of years. The postmodern leftists of so-called ISKCON want to hollow you out and fill you with themselves. They believe that their brand is the best, and that since totalitarianism is inevitable anyway, why not accept their ISKCON version of tyranny? They may appear superficially to be really nice guys, but that disguises some vicious swords inside decorated scabbards. There will be no debates. They believe that they are right, and they are damned determined to prove it. It is our duty to match their determination and fight them in every way. This is not a war over some quibbles about policy or process. You cannot remain a lightweight without eventually paying the price for not stepping up and confronting their deviation. Yes, there are many heavy realizations that must be assimilated. Guru means heavy, and the Guru forces us to confront certain realizations in Krishna consciousness which are also heavy. The peddlers of false promises have to be confronted, and that confrontation is way past due. Can you handle these truths? Guru means genuine Guru. Someone who is not a guru cannot be a bad guru because there is no such thing as a bad guru. The pretender is a bogus guru, meaning he is not a guru. A bogus guru who attains his status via institutional appointment, vote, non-veto, or no objection certificate is known as an institutional guru. Institutional guru means bogus guru, even if he superficially appears to be heavy. Such intimidation, projected via style and image, is not the heaviness of a real guru. All of the ISKCON gurus since December 1977 have been institutional gurus because all of them, without exception, were dependent upon the governing body of the international organized religion in order for them to romp and stomp in playgrounds provided by the GBC. Although some of them cut wildcard profiles and acted on that, once the governing body turned on any of them, They either capitulated or were destroyed in due course by the commish. Can you handle this? You need to be able to do so because there are many other heavy realizations concomitant to it based upon its inexorable validity. Very early on in his Western mission, on March 2nd, 1966, His Divine Grace, in a platform lecture, gave us this succinct definition of Guru. Quote, "Now, to take such guidance means the spiritual master must be a very perfect man. Otherwise, how can he guide?" Were those 11 pretender Mahabhagavats very perfect men? Can a so-called zonal acharya be anything but a bogus guru? They were not perfect men, and how their GBC-sanctioned scam played out in a mere 8 years proved that fact beyond a shadow of a doubt. They misguided and degraded virtually everyone who contacted them. They were masters of imitation and deception and image, but they were not masters of spirit. Now, are you a logical individual? You had better be. Otherwise, you will once again be misled like almost everyone was back in the day, your host speaker not included. If you are logical, you will admit that the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats, Sahajiyas all, were not bona fide spiritual masters. Once admitting this, how can you claim that they were empowered to transmit the Bhakti Lata Bij to any of their disciples? Can you deal with this deductive logic? It should be plain as the clear waters of an azure lake on a sunny day that none of them initiated any of their followers, or if you prefer disciples, with the real thing. So what was the status of those people? Since they were not properly initiated, what were and are they? Are they advanced devotees? Here's what Prabhupada has to say about the whole thing in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Leela, Canto 1, Text 35, and the purport to that verse. Quote, "One who is not properly initiated may present himself as a great devotee, but in fact he is sure to encounter many stumbling blocks on his path of progress towards spiritual realization, with the result that he must continue his term of material existence without relief. Such a helpless person is compared to a ship without a rudder, for such a ship can never reach its destination." Unquote. Cheap gurus, cheap disciples. Do you accept the obvious implication? Or is your wild mind searching for some way to get around it? One is properly initiated when he is initiated by a bona fide spiritual master. One is improperly initiated when he is initiated by a bogus guru. The formula is fundamental. Anyone can understand and accept it. Anyone, that is, who is free from concoction, vested interest, and bias. Appropriately, calling it the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. What is this conglomeration today? You opine that the gurus subsequent to the Magnificent 11 must have been genuine spiritual masters. But how can that be? Was the slate made clean in 1987? Most definitely it was not. Some of the more egregious players were disciplined or removed, and their disciples were strongly pushed towards what was euphemistically called, quote-unquote, reinitiation. But did that constitute an actual revolution? It was anything but. First of all, although all of the pretender Mahabhagavats had to dismount their elevated seats in 1987, all but one, that is, Many of those men still remained recognized as genuine gurus by the GBC at that time. Accordingly, their disciples were still considered bona fide initiates. This has strong implications connected to it, does it not? When the next wave of institutional gurus were voted to the post in the early 80s, almost all of them took Uttamaadhikari worship, and most of them were kept on as guru in 1987. By the time the mid-80s rolled by, many senior men had been voted in, or if you prefer, not vetoed, as new gurus in so-called ISKCON. All of those misleaders from that time on were 100% connected to the Magnificent 11 and the 1978 hoax, even if some of those newer gurus criticized the old guard. The scam was never uprooted. Instead, it was conveniently papered over or dismissed with one-liners such as, well, we tried the single acharya system for a while and it failed, so then we tried something better. Such a cavalier attitude cannot disguise the fact that in the late 70s and early 80s, immeasurably severe damage was done to most of Prabhupada's initiated disciples, as well as to all of those misguided new people who drifted in after Prabhupada departed. Of course, some of them were in on it from the beginning, so they're in another category, as they were not and are not innocent. Nevertheless, all of the new devotees were not properly initiated in Krishna consciousness after the founder Acharya left the scene. Is this too heavy for you to admit? Some may say that this historical explanation that I've just given you is just too damn extreme. So for those of that opinion, what alternative explanation then becomes viable? Whatever concoction is put forward, if you analyze it with higher intelligence, you will readily admit to yourself that it is even more extreme than the actual history I have presented here. So let me offer this one radical alternative explanation to show you how this is so. So 11 Sahajiyas, enjoined by Prabhupada, as were all of his initiated disciples, to be nothing more than regular gurus, although none of his disciples, including the 11, were ever recognized as having even attained that platform. So 11 Sahajiyas divided the world up into their own fiefdoms. These were called guru zones, and those men were called zonal acharyas. They took Uttamaadhikari worship from anyone and everyone, including their own god brothers and god sisters. They created an unauthorized acharya board within the GBC so that anything they said or did could not be challenged or even questioned by any of the other commissioners. After all, these recent Ritviks were supposedly now the sum total of all the demigods, so how could any conditioned soul dare doubt any one of them? What to speak of mounting even a minor challenge? As the alleged successors to his divine grace, the Magnificent 11 went on to concoct all kinds of pada names and so-called pranam mantras for themselves, and they sat atop elevated opulent seats in Prabhupada's temples. Within this paradigm, somehow or other, all of the newcomers who became their disciples are believed, by themselves and similar fools, to have achieved genuine devotional initiation from those pretenders. And you say that this is not extreme? It is extreme to the max. It is an example of how truth is stranger than fiction. Who could have imagined that Prabhupada's movement could have been ruined in that way? Yet it has been. And if you are an ISKCON enabler, it is time for you to stop prostituting yourself like that. The passive intimidated are also implicated and allowing this massive deviation to gain the traction that it has. That crypto-leftist movement is now loaded with big-time enjoyers and their enablers. And who are these enablers? They are of different varieties. Their worst manifestation are the former party men who had developed a powerful reputation, perhaps in some cases as personal servants or secretaries to Prabhupada, and who, although now living outside the temple environs, have a vested interest in ISKCON institutionalism. The most obnoxious of that bunch believe that loyalty to so-called ISKCON is the only ticket to deliverance. They call their mentality, that mentality and affiliation, which they represent, as the ISKCON line. Oh yeah. The Western Hindus are the revenue enablers, obviously, but anybody who still believes and preaches that the cult had or has genuine gurus, and therefore still has properly initiated disciples of those so-called gurus, is also an enabler. Now, this may be considered a heavy truth to handle, but it is truth nevertheless. Time to stop being a lightweight. As pure spirit soul, you are better than that. Time to come to grips with these facts and these truths. All of them have been presented here for your edification. So think about these things. Sareva Samya.